Hello everyone, welcome to the fifth and final episode of the ANU Climate Change Institute's series on COVID-19 and climate change and their intersections. Today we're going to be talking about Pacific impacts and climate negotiations and the interplay between those. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on who we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present and to their emerging leaders. We've all suffered in various ways, to a greater or lesser extent, from the coronavirus, the pandemic, the lockdown. Clearly, Australia also suffered from climate change. We've talked before about the implications in terms of health, the implications in terms of emergency management and similar things. Today, we want to lift that up to the elements of international policy and the climate negotiations. So we're really fortunate to have two excellent presenters and people engaged in the topic. We've got Professor Howard Bamsey here and also Professor Meg Keane. I'll introduce them in a second, but just to say that both of them are critically engaged in the issues that we're talking about today. Do you want to just fix the... So while we're sorting out the sound, I just want to introduce Howard, who's going to be our first presenter. So what we're going to have is a couple of presentations followed by a substantial Q&A session with the aim of finishing by 5 to 1. So Howard has had an incredibly illustrious career with many very significant roles. At the moment, he's chair of the Global Water Partnership. He's also an honorary professor here at ANU with the School of Regulation and Governance. Howard has had, amongst other things, direct involvement in the climate change negotiations for many years and has great experience in this topic. Howard,
thanks very much, Mark. You've asked me to speak about the implications for the climate negotiation of the COVID crisis, and that means I also have to talk about the implications for domestic action on climate change by the countries who engage in negotiations, because those two things are always related. And when you turn to that topic, the first sentence you hear on every occasion, I think, at least that I've heard, is this is a unique opportunity because there is going to be a lot of government intervention and investment and support for the recovery that countries will face after the pandemic has gone. And people also say, well, governments that listen to science make sense and takes them forward. I'm not sure about either of those propositions. I don't think you can assume that just because governments have listened to scientists on the COVID response, they will suddenly start doing so when they have before on climate. I think there are a different set of political factors that underpin how governments respond. So I'm not sure that will happen. And the public funding, well, let's see what is happening on that. If you look at what governments are doing, and this bears on the content of the climate negotiations, and I'll come back to that later. The EU and Korea are committed to green recoveries. I'm not sure what will actually occur as a result, but that's a commitment. So a public commitment, and that's welcome. There was a poll taken on UN Environment Day in Australia, and 70% of Australians who responded said they expected the government to give priority to environment in our recovery. But on the other hand, there's a research study that's being undertaken by a group of 4 organisations looking at G20 responses. The Australia Institute is one of the organisations, and they've found that on the whole, G20 countries are going to do more for fossil fuels in the recovery than for clean energy. There are some exceptions, but that's a sort of general picture. We've seen just recently the ICAO Council has decided to postpone the aviation offset arrangement for a few years. Perfectly understandable. No industry's been hit harder than aviation. There are lobbying efforts going on around the world to see governments step back from action and commitments that they've taken. And we know that when you get on a slippery slope, you can go backwards very quickly. Just think, for example, about what's happened on plastic this year. I mean, for the last several years, we've globally made, I think, really significant efforts to reduce the amount of plastic going to waste. But PPE this year is going to change that dramatically. So once you turn around, once you stop, you start, I think there's a real danger of going backwards. So I think in terms of what countries are doing domestically, we have really a pretty patchy record, and we have not much evidence yet that we can expect a green recovery broadly. And that goes to the content of the climate negotiations. But first, in sort of classic analysis of what negotiations are, let's look at the process. The COP and the subsidiary bodies meetings, which are the main decision-making processes of the climate negotiations, have been postponed until next year. This means inevitably there is a loss of negotiating momentum and the opportunity for countries to leverage each other and build ambition is just reduced. On the other hand, it does provide more time for diplomatic heavy lifting, even if that has to be virtual, at least for the present. So I don't think you can see in the process changes in the climate negotiations as a result of COVID any real indicator that somehow that will be a positive, will have a positive impact. And if you add up the content question based on what we know now of what countries will do domestically, I think the conclusion you probably have to reach is that it's simply more uncertainty. We know less about what countries are likely to bring to the COP, and this is supposed to be the ambition COP. This is where countries will step up their efforts. We know less now, and we can be less confident about what they'll do than we were before COVID. So I think if we ask ourselves then, what does this uncertainty mean for ambition? It's difficult to be optimistic. We can say that it does give the UK a clear period if travel restrictions are reduced. It gives them a clear period for really pressing hard diplomatically, and they have very capable service to support that. I'm sure their ministers and prime minister will be engaged, but I'm still wondering whether countries will really lean forward and bring more ambitious targets. They'll simply be preoccupied by other things. I think that's going to be a very big part of it. And also, I think if you put yourself in the position of a prime minister or a minister after the pandemic, what you want to do is, and what citizens will be demanding, is reassurance that all of this change and all of the upheaval is going to calm down, and there'll be a great temptation to return to business as usual. So I wish I could be more optimistic, but that somehow the climate negotiating process will emerge stronger, more ambitious, and become resilient as a result of the COVID pressures. But I can't see it at the moment.
Yeah, very interesting. So one of the aspects there is obviously people are going into the negotiation with increased uncertainty. They're also probably going to go into the negotiation with increased national debt.
Yeah.
And that also will be playing on people's minds.
Yeah.
So it seems to me there's an opportunity for, well, the default position may be we're in debt, so we can't afford to act on climate change. An alternative is we're in debt, and taking significant action on climate change is actually a great investment. And in fact, it's a very positive thing to do, both in terms of employment, but also in terms of bringing down future debt, because you're going for cheaper electricity, etc. So how do you think that might play out?
Well, I mean, we know that that is very often the case, and the analytical support for that perspective is very strong, but there are enough signals in the Australian political landscape, I think, to show that that doesn't always get through. That the expectations of people who've already been dislocated and upset and put out and have faced already significant economic burdens, their expectations are that they'll be able to do again what they were doing before. And I think that's a very strong element in the way the politics will work out. So I would like to think that rationality will prevail, and that people will see that this is the time to make this. It is the unique opportunity to make these investments to strengthen the economy in the longer term. And I'm in no doubt that, you know, as you, that's the best way to proceed. But I'm not confident that that's how politicians will read the need, the political need.
So our next presenter is Meg Keane. Meg's a professor at ANU. She's the director of the Pacific Security College here, and previously was at the College of Asia and Pacific, working strongly into the Pacific. So Meg, how do you think this is going to play out?
So that was really useful, Howard. And what I want to do is take some of those points and put it in the Pacific Islands context, because they are very important to us. It's where we spend our most aid dollars. And so what's happening there? Just to give a little context before I dive in, I think anybody who's beaming into this sort of podcast would realize that the Pacific Island countries are some of the most vulnerable in the world. And that has to do with their low-lying countries. It has to do with their high reliance on coastal fisheries, agriculture, and susceptibility to extreme climatic events. With respect to COVID, and I want to eventually look at this interaction, the Pacific Island countries have been remarkably successful at shutting down their borders quickly. Of the 21 countries and territories in this region, only 6 have incidents of COVID that are detected. 4 of those are in the double digits and quite contained. And then we have countries like Papua New Guinea that have doubled, trebled in the last week, and in the last fortnight gone up about 8-fold because of testing. So the economic impact is what's really going to hurt, similar to an extreme climatic event, cyclone, etc. And we expect it will take 5-10 years for recovery, so that you can start to feel these similarities coming together between climatic COVID, and then in this area they've interacted. I'll talk about that. Just to quickly pick up on one of Howard's points about what does this mean, these climate change postponements till next year, I think you'd have to say for the Pacific Island countries, it's a disadvantage. Disadvantage because these are the forums where they can form strategic alliances with other small island states, with the those with high ambition for a change, with the G77, and they get the support of NGOs and scientific bodies to really push home the key point that their leaders are on the record again and again of saying that climate change is the biggest security threat to these countries. They need action now, and they can only get that action with global coalitions taking the issues forward. So they've lost for this year that platform to push for international ambition. And I won't maybe labor the point because Howard has made it, but for these countries, global financing is dreadfully important. And with the economic hardship that has gone on and the loss of these platforms, the likelihood is there's going to be less commitment this year, and that starts to cascade down in the years. If we look at our own country of Australia, we've pivoted our aid towards dealing with COVID-19, and if the pie doesn't get any bigger, de facto, there's going to be less money potentially for responding to climate change and adaptation, unless we're very, very smart on how we spend money in the recovery. And I want to come back at the end to that point. So that's the international environment, and I think we can continue on that later if you want to. But I think really important is looking at what does this mean in the region and what are the lessons? Some of them are quite positive that we can learn with respect to building resilience. So if these climate trajectories continue the way we think they are and the pressures are going to build, how do we build up the resilience for better responsiveness? In the Pacific, just 2 weeks after the lockdown occurred for COVID-19, we had Tropical Cyclone Harold, and that hit very hard. It was a system, a Category 5 system. It hit very hard Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands in their rural areas. Now, that cyclone is not necessarily a product of climate change, but it is very representative of what these intense events are going to look like. What was interesting was because donors and NGOs could not get into these countries because it was locked down, they had to do what we always said we should do, which was to localize responses, to rely on the leadership. When you couldn't get food aid quickly where it needed, to look around the country where it was, and it was actually the women's groups and the church groups that found ways to get root crops from where there was abundance to where there wasn't. So the evaluations, which have been independent, just rapid and very quick, have come up with that this was one of the best responses. People weren't falling over each other, that local systems were able to step up, more traditional systems were able to kick in. So the conclusion of one by the Humanitarian Assistance Group was Tropical Cyclones response represents a point of no return for local humanitarian leadership in the Pacific. And our own work on resilience and area-based responses that's going on currently has these positive outcomes. So a silver lining to what is not a good situation. The other thing that's become clear, if it wasn't already, is we really have to strengthen the food systems to respond to these crises in countries where subsistence is very high and the reliance on agricultural systems and commodity exports is high. And that was found when all these people who lived in the cities and lost their jobs went back to rural areas. So you have population pressures on these places, but you have coral bleaching, and there was reports with the rapid assessments by World Fish, et cetera, that there were food shortages going on in these countries. And we can do things to strengthen these systems. It's still very weak how you move food around these countries. Part of the recovery funds were giving seeds, seedlings, root crops, some of them climate resistant, so they've been doing their research so we get it out faster. Certainly there was more investment, or there has been in the past, in those villages that benefited from better storage of crops could respond better, and those that didn't had to look elsewhere for assistance. So we need to really be investing a bit more in that if we're building resilience. Finally, I would say in these countries where the economic hits are big and hard and lasting for 5 to 10 years, we do have to think about social protection, and that won't be a Western response of job seekers and job keepers. It's just not possible in these countries. But there's been a bit of innovation, and I think we need to keep thinking about whether it's cash transfers, which sometimes work well, sometimes don't, but we can make it work well, whether it's seedlings, whether it's money to small and medium enterprises, what it is that's going to give social protection after these events. Certainly, we still are really weak at helping informal sectors. They just keep falling off the side of our responses. So Mike, if I was to conclude with all of that, it's that these development partnerships are important. Localization doesn't mean cutting out the community. It means respecting the system, strengthening them, and working with them. And if our assistance is strategic, and we start to do things that help now, but in the future, we're going to get greater resilience. That might be investing in labor mobility, in green energy, which will create jobs, but reduce expenses on fossil fuels. It might be support for food production. There's lots that could be done. And so if I were to end on a positive that came across my desk this morning, is the PNG Australia comprehensive strategic and economic partnerships just come out. And one bit in that is the biggest investment in a solar project of its kind in the Pacific and the Markham Valley. Jobs, green energy, resilience, so it's a positive. Training for people to not only meet the needs of Papua New Guinea, but to get them more mobile. So we can do things better, I think, if we invest in people, if we invest in the environment during these economic recoveries and look to the long term as well as the short term.
Okay. Thanks, Megan. I think this sort of ideas about compound and cascading issues are really coming into play here, because clearly they're increasingly connected systems, and that exposes us to those sorts of changing types of risk profiles, and local capacity is a critical part of responding to those. And so I think you made some really great points there. So Juliet, have we got the questions through?
There's no questions as of yet, so you might want to invite some people and if you want to start with questions.
Yeah, well, I guess to the audience, if you're interested in submitting questions for Howard and for Meg, then please submit them through the Q&A function it's down at the bottom of your screen, and then you can vote on other people's questions if you want to, so that we can see which questions are most important or there's most interesting. So so please start up with some questions. But I guess just to kick off, one of the things you haven't mentioned, Meg, is remittances. And in many Pacific Islands, there's a strong dependency on that. And often it seems, from what I've read, the people in those countries overseas are the ones who actually are the ones who are most vulnerable to the COVID. And so the capacity to actually contribute remittances is very disproportionately reduced. And so that, again, that's that sort of cascading influence there.
And then again, there's two components to that, and the estimates are that those remittances will go down by at least 20%, because of course these are also people most vulnerable to losing their jobs. But if we're looking for what do we do about that, because it is important, it's up to over 30% of places like Tonga for their remittances. But if you look at a country like Australia, it costs a lot to remit back home, and we're still about 4% above the global average, and that we could do something about that quite quickly. And we could take measures for those still able to remit, to get that money back in a cost-effective, low-cost way, so that it goes directly to households. We can track remittances. It's invested in education, shelter, small, medium enterprises. So it's probably the best aid we could give to get that system working well. We've just had some discussion about opening a little bit more in Australia, the opportunity for labor mobility. And I have to say that's good for Australia and our rural industries as well as the Pacific. So we get that working well, and they can invest themselves in what will make them resilient. It gives a capacity, it's a win-win situation. It seems to me that's a place where we should be thinking and expanding a lot more for just multiple benefits.
Absolutely great. We're still waiting for additional questions. So I guess Howard, one of the things you raised was postponement of COP. It is, in a sense, it's provides an opportunity if countries want to engage in that to build up their ambition to take the COP. But do you see a significant move towards that, or are there things that perhaps can encourage that across different groupings?
I haven't seen a move to it yet, Mark, but I may have missed it. But I suspect that probably people are still getting themselves organised, and it's very difficult to move from a mode where it's all about contact in the corridors and in meeting rooms, and that's how you do business, to a virtual one when you've got 195 parties involved. That's a challenge for Zoom or any other system, I think. Though there have been some meetings that have continued, but they haven't been, at least as far as I can see, haven't been the broad representative ones. They've been special UNFCCC task group meetings, and that's probably allowed people to talk about how they move forward in a more systematic way. I think next year, as soon as there's some return to travel of some sort, you'll see a big effort by the UK, and they will take very seriously their responsibility as host of the COP to ensure that it is a successful one. So you can expect that. I mean, if I were the Australian Prime Minister, I'd be waiting for the call from British counterpart asking us to help them by building a more ambitious Australian package to take to the COP. And I'm sure that they'll say, and when you've done that, then talk to your neighbours about doing the same thing. So that's the way that the UK will proceed. I'm certain that they'll give very high profile to it, and that will start to galvanise the system again. And since we won't have the COP now until the end of the year, it will provide some time for that momentum to generate again.
Sounds good. So I've got a couple of questions coming in. One from Elise Howard, and it says the Australian government economic recovery response is largely uninspiring. So home renos and prioritisation of construction, etc., despite the experience of gendered impact of COVID and I guess inequities associated with that, and the positive impact, economic impacts of paid childcare, etc. So a green-led recovery seems to offer much potential, but how can they be taken up by the government or presented to the government without appearing to be too progressive and alienating their base?
Well, that's an easy question. I don't know the answer to that one. I think first it assumes that that the government will see the case, or very clearly see the case for the sort of green investment you were talking about initially, Mark, and that it's a way of meeting all sorts of social needs apart from dealing with the climate challenge. And I'm not sure that there's any evidence that that's likely to be the case. But having done that, then you've got the political calculus of keeping the more extreme members of the political parties at bay. And I have no idea how you deal with that. I think Malcolm Turnbull's told us a bit about it, but he didn't ultimately wasn't able to deal with it either.
Okay, so there's another question which is follows up on the sort of funding aspects that you raised, Meg, but it probably can be addressed by both. So the question is really about what's the best mechanism to get funding to the Pacific states, for example, through the Green Climate Fund. And so what do we have to do differently from what we're doing now?
I think the Green Climate Fund, they have been able to access that better. To begin with, there was a lot of concern that it's just too hard, too clumsy to get at that money. Those concerns are still there, and interestingly, the Pacific Island Forum has set up a Pacific Resilience Facility, and it's still embryonic and it's not going to go very far, very fast at the moment in the current climate, but the idea was to get 300 to 500 million in that fund And it could be locally managed. You could deal with demand at context and more easily accessed. Interestingly, with that fund, which is a bit different to say a green climate fund, is it was for resilience. So they're using it for COVID as well as for climate. It's more flexible than some of these other highly siloed or highly subject. And as we were talking before, climate change doesn't happen in isolation, especially in countries with significant development challenges. So it's really hard to just, it's like climate refugees, et cetera. It's hard to pull things apart. And so I don't know if we make it more difficult for ourselves the way we are setting up some of these international funds. It's understandable why they happen, but they're a bit hard to access, and they are for one kind of problem, even though things are interacting. It makes it a bit more complicated. So I do think we've got to think about it in these kind of places, and we have done a lot of good work on facilitating access to these funds, but are there regional mechanisms that are faster, more effective, less cumbersome? And when is it just better to do bilateral negotiations? Because in this area of the world, Papua New Guinea and Tuvalu are extraordinarily different places, and sometimes tailoring is going to work better. A bilateral approach is going to work better. And I think donors, partners are recognizing that. So they have their own programs and thinking about the pressures that are in these different countries, which really vary hugely. So I think a little bit more of thinking about mechanisms that can deal with different contexts quickly and effectively.
How you've got direct experience.
Well, I just add one thought, and that is that combining the bilateral and the multilateral can often be very successful. And when Australia was participating in the Green Climate Fund, we invested $200 million. And I think, to be very straightforward about it, that largely as a result of Australian efforts, the Green Climate Fund ended up investing at that point, much more since, but at that point, something like $600 million in the Pacific. So what that was a combination, was Australia working to develop projects that could be taken to the Green Climate Fund. I'm thinking Tina River Hydro, for example, of the port in Nauru, where you had some Australian investment used to leverage Green Climate Fund investment, and you get a very good result. In fact, I wondered when you mentioned the Markham Valley solar project, does that involve GCF funding at all? Because I know that there was some discussion about it.
Yeah, I don't know. And there's other projects, how these, exactly what you're saying is how you get these synergies. Because of course at APEC, there was the announcement that that Australia, New Zealand, US and Japan would come together to get 70% electrification around Papua New Guinea. So a very high ambition proposal. Surely that could dovetail with this sort of thing, so you get complementarity.
Exactly.
And I think your point's really important, because Australia's also done this successful leveraging of funds with World Bank, of course, and their work in the Pacific, and the ADB and their work in the Pacific, and trying to get these priorities for adaptation, mitigation, smart investments just higher on the agenda, and get those funds leveraged and more easy to access for very small countries without a lot of capacity to spending mountains of time and effort on applications and reporting to various bodies. Exactly. So it's a really important point, I think, in terms of effectively using the funds that are available. Certainly more important now, Mark, when you think of funds are going to get tighter. There's no way around that. With COVID, funds are going to get tighter. So we have to be much more efficient and effective of how we're getting this money and how we're combining and working together to deal with these significant impacts and needs for adaptation around the region.
So just following up from it, there's a question about the role of private investment in this to sort of back up those sorts of things that you're saying. And particularly it just says, what can be done to for governments to encourage or provide mechanisms of support for enhanced investment, particularly with those companies that have signed the principle
responsible investment.
Yeah.
So, people who are already, or companies that are already on that pathway, and they perhaps just need a bit of a helping hand to become more serious about it.
I think there's enormous potential for investment in climate-friendly activity in the Pacific. There's no area in the world where the business case is likely to be stronger for renewable energy than an island country, because you're displacing, if you provide renewable energy, you're displacing very expensive diesel that has to come from a long distance, and so it's a lay down as air in investment terms. The question is, why isn't it happening? And I think there are all sorts of obstacles. I know one. I'll have to be very careful here, but there is one island region of the world where it was very clear that, on close scrutiny, it was very clear that vested interests remain very strong and very well connected. I think that's also likely to be the case in many other parts of the developing world. And also I've seen, and I think I hesitate to mention it because I know people will be appalled, but I've seen institutional rivalry as a serious obstacle to finding creative, innovative ways to encourage private investment. There is a huge need for innovative financial instruments, because the old way of looking at investment won't fit Pacific Island countries, for example. You need to do things in a new way. But there are a lot of people, in fact, people less than a kilometre from here who are ready to do that with hundreds of millions of dollars at their disposal, but they're not getting the response from the institutions that are responsible for this activity in the region. It's a really serious problem, I think, and it's a tragedy that this funding is not online.
I think you could go one step further in that chain. It's the private sector in these countries. Right? It's all very nice to get the solar farms set up, but who's going to maintain them? And I've seen again and again on the outer islands where there's been a solar panel set up to charge phones, etc. Something goes wrong. Nobody knows how to fix it. Solar panel's making a very nice dinner table, but not doing its purpose. So if you're going to do these investments, you got to think about what is the indigenous group that you are supporting to get the business up to service wherever you're putting solar, wind, wave, whatever energy around. And that too has, one, it has a higher return on your investment. Two, it's building skills that are needed in the country and needed elsewhere, so you're helping with mobility. Transferable, if you talk to state-owned enterprises for utilities and for water, they can't get engineers. They can't get people who understand electric circuitry. So what do? You bring it in at high cost. So I'm just saying that if we invest in green energy in these countries, we invest in the people in the countries to maintain it, and one day run businesses that might also supply and service, etc. But you got to finish that private sector investment. It's not just about subsidies for Australia, New Zealand, whoever firms to get the things set up in country. At that point, you've got to do the follow through.
Frankly, subsidies are the last thing you need in the Pacific. There's been a lot of money wasted subsidising. As I said, the business case is potent. You can make money on renewables, and investing in the people is the surest way to undertake investment. There are many examples, including from Green Climate Fund projects, of many examples of doing it right, just as you're saying, Meg, where very often, I can think of several projects in which the focus has been on training women in villages to do the maintenance, because they've been reliable, they haven't been attracted by the bright lights of the city, they've stayed around, they've learned how to do it, and they've maintained the solar panels very effectively.
And there's no reason you can't have a little session in the schools. I mean, look at our own society. You have a problem at home and you get one of the kids to fix it up, right? So some of these kids don't have access to computers. They don't have this sort of knowledge base. But if you did it, you'd be transforming a generation that was coming how. So it's just thinking, just like we do with environmental response, you got to think about the whole system and how the whole system's going to keep feeding itself to sustain itself. And that's got to be true when you're talking about business investment, is how does it get sustained and how are you bringing up that next generation to take it a step further? Because if you're going to make things work in a context, you need the people that live in the context to adapt it, to get it to live. So yeah, the private sectors is a nice one to think about, but you got to think it all the way through. It's like thinking supply chains right from the farm gate to the time someone eats it. It's not just about increased productivity on the farm, it's how is it going to move through the system and is that effective and efficient? And that's the same with any kind of private sector investment.
Yeah. So it builds on that point you made earlier about building local capacity and in many, many different ways. So just to sort of do a little bit of a segue and also to revisit territory we've already partly covered, there's a whole series of questions about green economic recovery and what's needed to do it. And quite a few of them relate to the politics of this. And we've talked about private investment. What's the case for political investment, not just in countries like Australia, but also in some of the Pacific ones, where the fortunes of the politicians are actually tied to this much more effectively? So the argument that's been put in a few of the questions is, Europe is going very strongly green, perhaps not quite as green this month as it was a few months back, but we see potential for a change in government in the US with in the White House with potentially a major sort of green tinge coming into the government there, and that tends to sweep other countries along in its wake, I guess, and in that circumstance you could actually make an argument that there's a valid case for political investment over and above what's being done now. How do you sort of see this playing out in the Pacific?
Trying to start or
You go ahead.
One, I think it's very hard to get the political buy-in, but I also think there is a space, and we've seen it with electricity, with matching funding. The MPs have large constituency development funds in many of the Melanesian countries to spend any way they want. But if you were to say that we have a fund, and whether it's solar or whether it's looking after coastal environments and reefs or whatever the thing is you're trying to advance to get more green investment, you could match it, or you could in some ways complement it so that there is a political commitment because they have some of their funds in this game, but they're also accessing complementary ones so that you're shaping investment and giving an incentive for it. I also think there's just good old education about what are the returns on investment. So the government is all the time spending, and you do it in the way you always had, unless somebody puts a compelling case that doing something different is going to go in your favor. Free energy once this thing's up and functioning, or more healthy reefs, or more productive agriculture. And that this can be a political asset as well as just a spending strategy. So, but it's tough because you're dealing with an old guard that has its interests, has its alliances, has where it gets its money from to sustain their political power, and that can be from economic interests that are very different to what green interests would be.
Yeah.
Anything else to add, Howard?
No, I think it's a hard task too. You really need politicians with the vision to see that changing business as usual is a wise investment for them, and it's going. Many will perceive it as a risk because those old ways of doing things are still attractive to many people. So I think
Let's kind of bring up the role of international NGOs, scientific groups, and I wonder with your international experience of where it is that they've really affected politics. And I know sometimes these striking reports with facts or ideas or investing in small projects which are flagships, which you're hoping inspire and create additional investment of this type. Probably, well, I'd be interested in where you think that has worked particularly well.
Well, I don't know about NGOs, but I know that there's a not-for-profit private fund called Acumen, based in New York, which has had a number of projects with the Green Climate Fund, which have done exactly that. They've created completely new ways of doing things and new industries, given birth to new entrepreneurs, to giving access to computers to people in villages because they suddenly have electricity which they didn't have before. Their education outcomes from that are enormous. So these things can happen. You can do truly transformational things. I think the point you made earlier, though, bears remaking, and that is that investing in the people is key. You can't walk in, do something flashy, ignore the local population and expect that that's going to do anything in the long term. We've seen so much aid money wasted in that manner over so many years, where someone gets a bee in their bonnet about something, a 2-year program is begun, something's built, and then someone else walks away from that, and you get a crumbling ruin. Yeah.
Indeed. So I guess there's a question sitting in there about essentially that implicit trade-off between a COVID response and sort of moving en masse to that versus potentially at the cost of the environment. So the question which has been raised is, are there policy innovations that could actually result in a more coherent response which doesn't have that trade-off? So we're sort of moving into that space, and the answer you just gave before, I think, actually starts to broach that. But perhaps just thinking a little bit more closely about policy innovation. So what could we perhaps do in Australia that would encourage that to happen? So if we're dealing with multiple issues, so it's not a hard trade-off between COVID and environmental issues.
Well, I gave some examples, I guess, in the talk about food security and social protection. There's a lot of overlap here. The other area that is very obvious, because it's been part of your podcast series, Mark, is health. The problem with this COVID pivot is, in at least the Pacific, 75% of people die from non-communicable diseases, not pandemics and epidemics. It's about a whole health system that needs desperately investment for the good of the people, but the resilience of the people, because comorbidity, whether you're talking about a cyclone or waterborne diseases or pandemics, epidemic, dengue, whatever, is what is hurting people. And there is another area where it's good for economic productivity, it's good for people's well-being, it's good for resilience. We have known for such a long time that these health systems need investment. World Health Organization reports, our own evaluations, but there's always something a bit more important that hasn't been done. And I think COVID has put a spotlight on it. It's not only needed for the COVID response. I think the last podcast you had on health security and climate security is saying we need this too for the future that's coming at us, these robust health systems. So there are not necessarily innovations in the brand new stuff, but things don't have to be innovative, they've got to be useful. And there's a lot of very useful things we could be doing to build resilience that isn't rocket science. Frankly, is solutions we already have. We just got to get behind them, put them in place, and find ways to sustain them so they're not these blips of investment, which is what worryingly is going to happen with COVID. Worryingly happens after cyclones. These investment blips, drop it off, and you don't get the long-term benefit from the engagement.
Yeah, I think it's always puzzled me, for example, why the insurance industry isn't more active in supporting resilience building activities. So if a cyclone comes, first thing that happens is that all of the water systems in the affected area go down and nobody has fresh water. That means that you have Hercules coming from Australia delivering bottles of fresh water. And if and this has happened in a number of places I've seen, instead, aid providers, the local government, and the insurance industry that's going to pay out on the damage eventually, got together and helped communities and societies build more resilient water systems. They probably saved themselves a lot of money. But it's not the way business happens somehow, and I don't know, why, because it's fundamentally sensible to prevent rather than to cure, I think, and it's doable in many cases. Not in all. I don't want to suggest that you can do this just easily every day, but put a bit of effort and thought and analysis and consultation with the local people into it, and I think those sorts of investments could be very, very productive.
Okay. Well, we've actually run out of questions from the audience, and so we've just got a couple of minutes ahead of time there. But if there's no other urgent questions coming in, I guess there's a whole range of points which I think have been brought up strongly here, which include the importance of sustained response and building capacity that actually feeds on itself, requiring change both within country and externally from countries like Australia. But there's a whole stack of tool boxes, tools in the toolkit already that can enable that, and so we don't have to invent a lot of other policies to do this. But at the same time, that we do have to do some things which are new, because we're not getting the private investment in the region, which could happen and which could have those benefits in terms of developing that sustained response. And so that there are some things which we've brought up here, which arguably can actually generate both benefits in terms of COVID and similar agendas, as well as the long-term climate change agenda. And so I think we've sort of explored quite a range of different topics, which I think are very relevant to the hand. I just to wrap it up, if you want to just make a quick sort of closing comment, each of you, and like a 30-second, 1-minute type comment.
Well, I think partnerships between local and the international community save lives. That's the reality. We just have to be a bit more effective and efficient about it, and tailor it to place. And I think that's sort of my key point on this engagement process.
I think that the case for the potential for green recovery is so obvious and so straightforward that hopefully even the most difficult and most dense of governments will eventually see it.
Fantastic. What a good note to finish on, and I think we're all hopeful about that, Howard, and it'll be interesting to see how it comes to play in the next months ahead of us. Anyway, I'd just like to thank the audience for your engagement and participation, to thank Juliet and Elise for organising this and running the logistics, and apologies for the early hiccup on the sound, but particularly to thank our two presenters here, Meg and Howard. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you.